The morning he told me to get out of my own kitchen, I was making oatmeal. Not his oatmeal. Mine. The steel-cut kind I had been making every single morning for 11 years since my husband passed and I learned to make breakfast for one. The pot was on the stove, the water was just starting to simmer, and I had my mug of tea beside me on the counter the way I always did. And my son-in-law walked in, looked at the stove, looked at me, and said, "We're renovating this space. You need to find somewhere else to be." I was standing in a kitchen I had owned for 23 years. I did not say anything. I turned off the burner. I picked up my mug of tea, and I walked out. That was the moment I knew something had to change. Not because of what he said, though what he said was bad enough, but because of what happened next. My daughter came around the corner from the hallway, looked at me holding my mug in the living room, looked at the pot still sitting on the stove, and she said nothing. She went to the refrigerator, took out the orange juice, and poured herself a glass. She said nothing. "My name is Gloria. I am 67 years old. I live in Hamilton, Ontario, in a house I bought with my husband Robert in 1999, the year our daughter turned 4. Robert passed from a stroke in 2013. After he was gone, the house became mine. The mortgage was paid off by 2017. I own it outright. I have the deed. I pay the property taxes every year without fail. In Hamilton, that comes to just over $4,000 annually, and I have never missed a payment. I tell you this not to boast. I tell you this because what happened over the next 3 years had a way of making me forget these facts. And I need you to understand how easy it is to forget what belongs to you when the people living in your home are very good at behaving as though it belongs to them. My daughter's name is Renee. She is 38 years old. She is smart and she is funny. And when she was small, she used to crawl into my bed on Sunday mornings and ask me to tell her the story of how her father and I met. I told her that story so many times I could recite it in my sleep. She always laughed at the same part. She has her father's laugh. She married her husband Daniel 6 years ago. I was at the wedding. I danced. I cried. I thought he seemed fine. The first sign that he was not fine came at Christmas dinner, 3 months after the wedding, when he corrected me in front of my sister about how to make gravy. I let it go. People are nervous around new family. I told myself that. The second sign came the following spring, when Renee called to tell me they were having some financial trouble. Daniel's contracting business had slowed down. They were behind on rent. Could they come stay with me for a little while, just until things steadied out? "Of course," I said. "Of course. This is your home too." That was 3.5 years before the morning in the kitchen. In the beginning it was fine. Uncomfortable in the way that 2 households becoming one is always uncomfortable, but manageable. I adjusted. I moved some of my things to make room for theirs. I stopped watching the evening news in the living room at 9 because Daniel went to bed early and the sound bothered him. I started cooking dinner later to accommodate his schedule. Small things. I told myself they were small things. What I did not do, and I have thought about this many times since, was talk about money. I did not ask them to contribute to the hydro bill, which went up considerably once 2 more people were living in the house, running the dryer at all hours and keeping every light on. I did not ask them to help with the gas bill through the winter. And in Hamilton, the winters are long, and the gas bills are not small. I did not ask for anything toward groceries, though I was feeding 3 people on a retirement income that was built for one. I did not ask because Renee was my daughter and she was struggling and I did not want to add to her burden. I did not ask because Robert had always said that family does not keep score. I did not ask because I thought the arrangement was temporary. Temporary stretched into 6 months. 6 months stretched into a year. A year stretched into 2. And somewhere in the middle of the 2nd year, something shifted in Daniel that I cannot explain except to say that the man who had been awkward and occasionally rude, began to behave like a man who believed he was in charge of something. He began making comments about the house. Small ones at first. The gutters needed cleaning. The back fence was leaning. The driveway had a crack in it. All of these things were true. All of them were also things I was aware of and had plans to address in my own time. But Daniel said them the way a landlord talks to a tenant, not the way a guest speaks to a host. He began having opinions about my schedule. When I had friends over for tea on Wednesday afternoons, he started appearing in the living room within 20 minutes, sitting in the armchair across from us, not speaking, just present in a way that made my friends uncomfortable. One of them, my friend Patricia, stopped coming after a while. She told me later she had not known how to say it at the time, but she had felt unwelcome. She was right. She had been unwelcome by a man who did not own a single square foot of the house he was sitting in. I told Renee once, only once, I said, quietly, that I was finding Daniel's behavior difficult sometimes, that I felt like I was being crowded out of my own space. Renee looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "Mom, he's just stressed. The business is still slow. Try not to take it personally." I did not bring it up again. The kitchen incident happened on a Tuesday in February. What came after it happened quickly, and I need to tell you exactly what it was, because it was not small. 2 days after the kitchen, I came home from a doctor's appointment to find that Daniel had moved my writing desk. I have had that desk since 1987. It was my mother's before it was mine. I kept it in the corner of the second bedroom, the room that had been Renee's when she was a child, which I used as a sitting room after she grew up and left. When I came home, the desk was in the hallway. And the sitting room had Daniel's tools and equipment stacked along the walls and a contractor's workbench set up in the center of the floor. I stood in the doorway of what used to be my sitting room, and I looked at my mother's desk in the hallway, and I felt something go very quiet inside me. I knocked on the bedroom door where Daniel was. He opened it. I said, "You moved my desk." He said, "I needed the space. I'm setting up a proper work area. The basement isn't big enough." I said, "That room is not a workspace. That is my room." He looked at me. And then he said, "Gloria, you have a bedroom. You don't need 2 rooms to yourself when we're all trying to make this work." He said we, as though the 3 of us were equal parties in some shared arrangement, as though my name was not the only name on the deed to this house, as though I had not lived here for 23 years and raised my daughter in this room and sat at that desk to write letters to Robert's mother after he passed because she was elderly and did not use email, and I had promised him I would keep in touch with her. I closed the door without answering him. I went to my bedroom, the one room in my own house that still felt entirely mine, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought about Robert. I thought about the way he used to say that a house is just walls and a roof, that home is the people in it. I had believed that for a long time. I was no longer sure I believed it, because I was sitting in a house full of people and I had never felt less at home in my life. That night, Renee came to my room. She knocked. She sat on the chair by the window. She said, "I know this has been hard." I waited. She said, "Daniel is really trying. He wants to get the business going again. Can you just give him a little more room?" I looked at my daughter. I looked at her for a long time, and I thought about how much of myself I had given over the last 3 years without being asked. The schedule changes, the lost Wednesday teas, the hydro bill and the gas bill and the groceries, my sitting room, my mother's desk in the hallway. I said, "Renee, how much more room would you like me to give?" She did not answer. She looked at her hands, and then she said she was tired, and she went back to the bedroom she shared with Daniel, the bedroom directly across the hall from mine, and I heard the door close. I did not sleep that night. What I did instead was think very clearly for about 6 hours. I thought about what I owned, and what I had allowed, and what I was going to do about it. And sometime around 4 in the morning, I got up, went to my desk in the hallway, opened my laptop, and I looked up the number for a paralegal office in Hamilton that a friend had mentioned to me the previous year when she was dealing with a tenant situation of her own. I wrote the number down on a piece of paper. I went back to bed. I slept for 3 hours. In the morning I made my tea in the kitchen, and I was not asked to leave, and I did not say a word to Daniel about what I had decided. I waited until he left the house to meet a client. Then I called the number. The woman I spoke to was named Sandra. She was patient, and she did not make me feel foolish. I explained the situation. She asked me some questions. She asked whether there had been any formal agreement when my daughter and son-in-law moved in. I said no. She asked whether they had been paying any rent or contributing to household expenses. I said no. She explained something to me that I had not known. She said that in Ontario, when a person lives in someone else's home without a formal lease, the situation is called a licensee arrangement, not a tenancy. A licensee has fewer legal protections than a tenant. The homeowner can ask a licensee to leave with reasonable notice. She said that reasonable notice in these circumstances is generally considered to be enough time to make alternative arrangements, and that in Ontario courts, for family members, this often means 30 days. 30 days. I had been living crowded in my own home for 3.5 years. The legal requirement was 30 days' notice. Sandra asked if I wanted her to prepare a notice to vacate. She said it would be delivered by a process server, which meant a person would come to the door and hand it directly to Daniel and Renee. She said it would be formal and it would be documented, and it would be clear. I said yes. I did not tell Renee. I want to be honest about this because some people will say I should have, maybe I should have, but I had tried to tell Renee. I had told her about Daniel in the living room, and she had told me not to take it personally. I had told her about feeling crowded out, and she had asked me to give him more room. I had spent 3.5 years trying to tell Renee, quietly, gently, in all the ways that felt safe and loving, and she had not been able to hear me. So I let the paper say what I could not. 3 days later, on a Thursday morning, I was in my kitchen making my oatmeal, the steel-cut kind. The pot was on the stove and my tea was on the counter, and I heard the doorbell ring. Daniel answered it. I know this because I heard his voice go from easy to sharp very quickly. I heard him say, "What is this?" I heard a brief exchange I could not fully make out, and then I heard the front door close. Daniel came into the kitchen. He was holding the envelope. He looked at me. He said, "Did you do this?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You're kicking us out?" I said, "I'm giving you 30 days' notice, as is my legal right as the homeowner." He said several things after that. I will not repeat all of them. He said I was being vindictive. He said I was tearing the family apart. He said that after everything they had done for me, meaning the 3.5 years they had lived in my home without paying rent or utilities, I was repaying them with betrayal. I let him finish. And then I said, "Daniel, I'd like to have my breakfast now." He left the kitchen. Renee did not speak to me that day, or the next. I heard them talking in their room at night, low voices, the kind of conversation that has weight to it. On the third day, she came and knocked on my door again. She looked different from the last time she had sat in that chair. She looked smaller somehow, or maybe just tired in a way she had not been letting me see. She said, "Why didn't you talk to me first?" I said, "I tried, Renee, several times." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He told me you've been difficult for months, that you've been trying to push us out." I said, "What do you think?" Another silence, a long one. She said, "I think I've been too close to it to see it clearly." That was all she said. She stood up and she went back down the hallway. But something had shifted in the way she moved, something I could not quite name, like a door opening a crack after being sealed for a long time. In the weeks that followed, things were hard. I will not pretend otherwise. The air in the house was thick with something unspoken. Daniel was cold and distant. Renee moved carefully, like someone walking on uncertain ground. I went about my days. I made my oatmeal. I went to my book club on Thursday evenings. I had Patricia over for tea on Wednesday, and she stayed 2 hours. With about a week left in the 30 days, Renee came to me again. This time she sat down and she talked for a long time. She told me things about the last 3.5 years that I had not known, the ways Daniel had spoken to her behind closed doors, the things he had said about me, the slow way he had positioned himself as the authority in a house that was not his, not even slightly. She cried. I held her hand. She said, "I think I've been protecting him instead of protecting us." I said, "You're seeing it now. That's what matters." She asked if she could stay. Not with Daniel. Without Daniel. She asked if she could stay while she figured out what came next. I said yes. Of course yes. This had always been her home. Daniel left on a Sunday, 3 days before the notice expired. He took his tools and his workbench and his equipment, and most of what was in the room that had been his. He did not say goodbye to me. He walked past me in the hallway carrying a box, and he looked straight ahead, and he was gone. That afternoon, Renee and I moved my mother's desk back into the sitting room. We had tea in there. She asked me to tell her the story of how her father and I met. I told it. We got to the part where she always used to laugh, and she laughed, and it sounded like her father. I watched the evening news that night at 9 o'clock, in my own living room, with the volume exactly where I like it. Not too loud, not too quiet, just right. The way it had been for years before someone came into my home and made me believe I had no say in such things. I want to tell you something, and I mean this for anyone who is listening and recognizes this story. Not necessarily the details, but the shape of it. The slow erosion. The way you accommodate and adjust and give ground until one day you look around and you are standing in a hallway holding a mug of tea in a house you own, and you cannot quite remember how you got there. You got there because you are generous, because you love someone, because you were raised to believe that family comes first and keeping the peace is its own kind of love. But there is a difference between generosity and disappearance. And no one who loves you should ask you to disappear. Your name is on the deed. Your hands paid the mortgage. Your life filled those rooms before anyone else arrived. And when the time comes that you need to say so, you are allowed to say so. You do not need to shout. You do not need to fight. You do not need to do anything except know what belongs to you and be willing to say it clearly. Sometimes clearly sounds like a knock at the door. Sometimes it sounds like an envelope being handed over on a Thursday morning while the oatmeal is on the stove. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to choose peace. I know this now in a way I did not know it 3 years ago. I am learning to stop apologizing for knowing it. My name is Gloria. I am 67 years old. I live in Hamilton, Ontario. I own my home. I make steel-cut oatmeal every morning, and I drink my tea while it simmers, and no one has asked me to leave my kitchen since. Not once.